This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a special episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is I'm here to talk of, title gives it away, the stories of films. And I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, release stories, marketing stories, any of the bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. What you've chanced upon here is one of my special episodes where I'm joined by a special guest to talk about their films, in this case a film coming out, and we dig back into a bit of back catalogue as well. So the guest this time is director Simon West, who's behind the new release now on DVD and Blu-ray Skyfire, which is a really ambitious Chinese action movie written by Weibo and Sidney King, starring Zhuqi Wang, Hannah Quinlivan, and mighty hello to Jason Isaacs. Now, what really interested me about this was the fact that it's directed by Simon West. And Simon West is better known for the films that he made in Hollywood. His directorial debut was a small independent movie by the name of Con Air. He went on to do The General's Daughter, Lara Croft Tomb Raider, When a Stranger Calls. He did three films with the Statham, The Mechanic, The Expendables 2 and Wild Card. And since then he's done a couple of movies. He did Stratton, he did Gunshy, but he's been making movies in China. So he's completed work on Skyfire, which makes it to the UK now, and he's in post-production on a movie called The Legend Hunters as well. And so I wanted to track him down to chat about all of this, because it's been quite a career that he's had, that he started off doing commercials and video shorts. Then he went on to have, Con Air, just as a first movie, is a huge project to take on for producer Jerry Bruckheimer, obviously starring Nicolas Cage. I've talked about Con Air on a separate episode of the podcast, but then it's often forgotten just what a hit The General's Daughter was and how that steamrolled into him landing the Tomb Raider gig as well. So what you're going to hear is a conversation where we address a lot of that, really. That we're going to start by chatting about Skyfire, and Skyfire is a movie, an action movie set on an island that's where someone's decided to basically build a theme park on a volcano, and it's as suitably daft as it sounds. It's visually hugely striking as well. There's been no shortage of effects work. I think even in the first 2 minutes of it, there's a ton of the stuff thrown at the screen. And so we chat about Simon going over to China to direct the film and how he had to basically direct it in two different languages. And then, as the conversation goes on, we'll talk about some of his older movies as well and have a chunter about those. So that's the setup. Not much more to tell you, short of, if I play you a clip from the Skyfire promo, be warned, it's quite loud. And then the other side of it, I'll go straight into my conversation with Simon West. Here's that clip.
There is no chance of this beast howling again for at least 150 years.
这座酒店是世界上最安全的地方。
糟糕！抓稳了！
是不是？
That then was a clip from Skyfire. I'm delighted to be joined by its director and the director of so many films that hopefully we're going to get a chat to talk about as well, Mr. Simon West. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Very well.
So I watched this film last night, and the canvas of it, I just I just thought was staggering. I do want to come to that, but if I've got this right, if I've got the history of it right, you were first sounded out about doing a film in China over a decade ago before you went to do this one. I wonder if you could kind of just trace the story a little bit for us.
Yeah, I mean, I've been interested in shooting something in China for quite some time, and I did have a project that I developed, which was a Chinese story about the massacre in Nanjing in the 30s. And I went over and I shot tests over there. Unfortunately, that film didn't come together, and it was an amazing story, but it was at a time also 10 years ago, and actually it's longer than that. I think it was like 13 years ago. And people weren't going to China to shoot, and it was very, sort of new territory. And in the last 13 years, obviously China's opened up amazingly, and now it's much easier to go there and shoot and do co-productions and sort of work with Chinese companies. So although I didn't manage to pull it off 13 years ago, when Skyfire came along, I jumped at the chance to do another film that actually was for the world. It's an international film, but it was made with Chinese producers, but everything else about it was completely international. So it was shot in Malaysia and a little bit in China, but a lot in the jungles of Malaysia, and with an international crew of 17 different nationalities.
And if I got this right, because I tried to dig in and just find a little bit more about the project, that there was a version of this film that was originally conceived almost as a visual effects driven film by Base FX before it became a bit more before it became storyfied. I'm just wondering, where in the midst of all of this did you step into that? Because you said this one came to you.
Yes, and it was brought to me as a story, and I just read it as a story, whether it was going to be CGI or real or anything. So I just read it as a story, and of course, because I tend to make live action films, I assumed it was a live action film. And then when I got into seriously discussing making it, the producer said, "Oh, well, we actually envisage making most of this on a green screen," and I went, "Oh, well, that sounds a little boring." And it's not my, forte. Obviously I use CG to enhance things and everything, but I don't tend to do fully animated films. And so I think just when they saw the expression on my face, they said, "Okay, but we can shoot it for real if you want." And so I then started planning how to do it for real. So that's when we ended up scouting locations all around the world and working out how you can actually make a volcano film for real without having to rely totally on CGI.
It was one of the things that struck me immediately watching it, because I got sent the film on a fairly plain looking DVD just to have a look at, and just the dramatic visual work right near the start of the film. It's notable. I think you have to go through about 2 minutes of logos for companies. I do want to ask you about that, because there seemed a real sense of collaboration to it. But right up front, this is a huge blockbuster, isn't it? That just because just because it arrived in a jiffy bag in my house on a DVD, I think this is a huge big screen film, and it looks like it's been made that way.
Yeah, I do tend to work, on a big canvas, and even if they do start off fairly modest, there's something happens, and it's a snowball going down the hill, and they tend to get bigger and bigger as you come up with more ideas. And it was conceived, as I said, it's an unusual international film, because it wasn't a Hollywood film that was then going to be shown in China. It was a film that was intended to be shown in all over the world, and very much so in China. And China movie business is so huge that a large release in the States, like one of my big films that goes in the States, or anybody's big film, would be on 5,000 or 6,000 screens, which would be huge. Well, in China, this opened on 20,000 screens.
Yes.
And so they're just 5 times bigger in every way than Hollywood. And so I actually ended up making, bringing my Hollywood experience to it, but it was shot very much to be shown in China. One version of it, I think probably the version you saw, was the English version, but I actually shot it two different ways,
Yes,
which made it even more complicated. And so, because it felt such an international story, because there's volcanoes all over the world, and it's a threat to a lot of people, and it's exciting to a lot of people to watch a film about that. So, in the end, I ended up shooting it in two languages. So I shot it in Chinese, and then I shot it again in English. So every scene was shot twice, and some scenes, remained in Chinese in the English version, and there's a lot of English in the Chinese version. So it was one of these sort of international mixtures that I got to play with in the edit. They are different. The Chinese version is obviously very different from the English version, but there's a lot of crossover that I hadn't planned, because the Chinese love to hear English. They love to practice the English, and it sounds cool when characters are speaking English to them. So, but it's also for sort of reality reasons, and also just for us to hear it. It's cool. Some of the scenes I kept in Chinese. So it's a real mixture of languages.
Well, the version I saw was Chinese subtitled, apart from Jason Isaacs and his amazing accent. I'm a huge fan of Jason Isaacs coming onto a film and doing a brilliant accent, and he was on fine form, particularly in this one. I thought he seems to be having a complete ball in the midst of this. But I wanted just to get to the nub of kind of the cultural mix you've got here, because I read that a number of actors were bilingual, that you did shoot the film twice, but also you've spoken in the past about very, very small cultural and tonal touch points with this film. So, for instance, the way it's described in China, as I understand, is it's a rescue film. It's not a disaster movie. And I just wonder if you can just get to a couple of those little nuances, because you said the two versions of the same film were slightly different.
Yes, I mean, it is a cultural thing, and I learned a lot about the culture. Working with a Chinese cast who were bilingual, so that's how I was able to shoot it in two languages. But I also could learn from them the cultural differences of what a Chinese audience sees a film as, and what a Western audience. And it is one of those things, like the Chinese would focus on the rescue aspect of it, and we would focus on the danger at the beginning, and like the jeopardy, and how scary it was. We love to be scared in the West, and I think we feel safe, and I think the Chinese love to feel safe and that they're going to be rescued when they're in the cinema. So it is. I don't know whether it's just the marketing side will emphasize one or the other, and whether really when the audience gets in the cinema and the seats, the whole audience, wherever you are, loves to be frightened and loves to be excited, and also likes to be rescued. So I don't know exactly where. I'm not a complete expert on it, but it definitely, they have a different interest in different parts of the film, and especially on things like humor. It was very interesting, because there'll be a few, obviously in action adventure films, you always try and put a bit of levity in, so it's not too dark. And so some of the scenes have, a humorous tone. And I would shoot it in Chinese, and then I would shoot it in English. And I had to change the sort of the style of acting, because the Chinese explained to me, they don't have deadpan humor the way, we do. So I was explaining, I said, they said, why aren't we screaming and shouting when we run into this scary room? There's lava, we're going to blow up, and we could be dying here. Why aren't we screaming and panicking? And we're saying these wry, humorous lines, very, understated. And I said, well, that's called deadpan humor. And they didn't say, well, we don't have that. So I taught them how to do deadpan humor for the English version. And then for the Chinese version, they come in screaming and shouting and panicking. It's still funny, but they like their humor, in a different way in a scene like that. They said, well, that's ridiculous. You wouldn't be calm and receive, but we, with our Western sort of stiff upper lip, we'd say, well, that's funny in a dangerous situation to be totally calm and underplay it. So there's cultural things with the humor was one thing.
Just to go to those logos at the start, and they only struck me just because there were so many of them, which suggests to me an awful lot of invested parties in the film. I think stakeholders is the buzzword, isn't it? I'm sounding all corporate for a second, but I'm just curious, when you're working with so many companies and effectively so many producers who've got that kind of investment in a movie, how does that contrast with working with someone like Jerry Bruckheimer, who's perhaps a little more singular?
Well, luckily, I don't actually get exposed to that huge group of stakeholders, as you say. I actually probably don't know or know of them until I also watch the titles and go, well, where did they all come from? And so there's a lot of business behind the scenes, and so I would tend, on a day-to-day basis, will deal with one or two people and have no idea how they've come with this huge pot of money, and but there's a lot going on in the background that obviously I'm not a party to. So I'm just as surprised when 15 logos come at the front of the film as anybody. I never met any of them, but I'm glad they did invest, and I'm glad they did all collaborate. And then, I do feel very grateful that they came and let me make the film. So I'm not complaining.
I mean, the whole film is so lean as well that it's really, really, really pacey. I think that's about the only thing I think that just bumps the running time up above what I'd ordinarily felt natural, really, was just that little bit at the start. One thing, I remember having a conversation with Jason Isaacs once, who was friendly with, and he talked about going and visiting Roland Emmerich while Roland was preparing to make The Day After Tomorrow, and how Roland Emmerich was surrounded by loads of books on weather and on science, and he viewed it that he wanted to know all of this just so he knew exactly what rules to break. Now, you've put a theme park, not to be too blunt about it, in the middle of a volcano and clearly had a terrific time doing it. How close to any kind of reality, just scientific reality, did you get with all of that? Because there's quite a lot of stuff in there that suggests it's closer than I think people would give you credit for.
Yeah, I mean, I also do loads of research,
yes,
because you can't make stuff up as well as the reality of things. So every book you open and every sort of internet search, you come across fantastic facts and fantastic images that you say, I've got to put this in, and it's all reality based. And so you tweak it, to make a movie. So, I mean, you say it may be, who the hell would build a theme park on a dormant volcano? But, in reality, there's 1,500 active volcanoes in the world, and 25 million people live underneath them. So, and these are the facts you research and you find when you're doing it. You say, well, actually, it's not so ridiculous. If there's 25 million people in cities, and even in Italy, living under Mount Etna, there's millions of people, and no one says, well, it's ridiculous to build a city under an active volcano, but they're doing it all over the world. So, it's not so ridiculous to have a theme park, especially, if you're one set of scientists is telling you it's okay, and the other set telling you it's dangerous. It depends your personality, which ones you're going to believe. If you're a half glass full, then it's all going to be fine. But if you're pessimistic, then you tend to go with the other scientists. And I think that's what happens in this film, in this story, is that the science is ambiguous for a while. And because Jason Isaacs' character is a dreamer, and half the reason he's got that great accent in it is because I think he's channeling Elon Musk.
Is that what it is?
He's a dreamer, and so he believes, what he wants to believe, because he thinks it's that he'll be the lucky one. He's the lucky guy who's touched by luck, and it couldn't happen to him. But how wrong he was.
If I can ask one more question on Skyfire before I talk about, I've held off talking Con Air for a long time. It's considerable restraint on my part. But this was originally envisaged as a trilogy, as I read somewhere. Is that still the case?
Well, I think all films, like to talk about sequels, and I always shut the people down when they say, "Of course, we'll set this up for the sequel." And I say, "Let's just concentrate on making this one great." And it doesn't matter what happens in the first film; you can always make a sequel. And even if everybody dies or the world blows up, you'll find a way to make a sequel if it's really good. The first film. So I think most people, especially producers and financiers, are always looking for a franchise, and if there's a way of getting another one out of this world, then they will. So I never really focus, even if say, oh, we'd love to make 3 of these. So yes, well, let's just concentrate on the first one, because even if it's good, sometimes you just don't want to go back to that same world again.
Well, we're talking about sequels. How's this for a segue? A few years ago, you put into the world the possibility of Con Air in space. That you said, and so I'm quite happy to sit here and have the exclusive that that's your next film. But was there ever any the slightest chance of that? Because I think I speak for a lot of people by saying I'd love to see Con Air in space.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely was a flippant joke that I made, and saying that the only way to make a sequel or something like that is to completely reinvent it, and it's whether it's Con Air the musical or Con Air in space, it's got to be really pushed. There's nothing worse than just making the same film again, but it's just slightly different, but everyone looks a bit older. So I think Con Air in space is a possibility. It could work. I mean, anything can work. But and actually, sci-fi is my favorite genre, even though I've never made a sci-fi film. It's the films I love to watch. So I'm very up for a Con Air sci-fi remake.
We're in, and let's not gloss over the fact that you've just mooted a Con Air musical there as well. And given that this will go out on the internet at some point, that now becomes cold hard fact, doesn't it? So
I hope so. I've already got some of the songs.
That would be amazing.
And some of the routines. So I'm definitely up for the music. I'd rather do the musical before the space one, probably.
Do a space musical Con Air sequel. That would be great. These are the kind of exclusives I live for. That's great. I mean, I introduced a screening back in my previous job of Wildcard that you came along and did an intro on. That fight sequence in Wildcard is great. And one of the things you talked about was shooting Con Air, about how it was this 100-day shoot. There were hundreds of people on a set. It was your first film. It was out in the searing heat. It was a heavily masculine set as well. I think it was one of the things you said at the time. And I'm curious because can you take us into that a little bit? Because I am many. Will fly the flag for Con Air until our dying days. That's as good a time I think I've ever had in a cinema, just watching that. And I'm curious what's that's like as a human being, just in the midst of that, making your first movie of that scale.
Well, it's all lots of things. So over 100 days, you have a chance to go through a whole myriad of emotions and physical states. And I think the first day was probably the hardest because it's such a shock, and you go, oh my God, how am I going to do this for another 100 days? And then I think after day 30 you hit a wall and you go, I can't do this more, because it is a giant machine to move. And then after a few more days or a couple of weeks, you sort of get into the swing of it, and it just becomes your daily job. And actually you can't envisage a time when you're not making Con Air. And somebody did come up to me and when you're sort of lying exhausted on the floor at the end of one day halfway through the shoot, and somebody came up to me and said, one day this film will end. And you go, yeah, you're right, it will. And so it's not forever, and it is survivable. And but it's a mixture of incredible excitement and incredible responsibility, weighing on your shoulders, because another person came up to me and said, "Are you really excited?" And I said, "No, I'm not excited. I'm terrified."
Yeah.
You try making a film like this, first time out, and it's only exciting when it's finished.
Yeah.
So,
because I read at the time, you had a choice of 3 films. There's a story you told a colleague of mine once about how you went to have a meeting with Jerry Bruckheimer, and you were sat in front of a wall of scripts, and he pulled 3 down and threw them at you. One of them was Con Air, one was a spy thriller, and one was a comedy. And I do wonder at some point if you're going to make an outright comedy, because as you say, there's comedy throughout so much of your work. But I just wonder, how close did you come to the other 2? I mean, was this...
Well, actually, it's more than that. It was actually, there were 3, it was 3 films from Jerry, but it was another 2 films. The comedy, and one was a romantic comedy from Sony, which was Columbia at the time, and then an English company was a spy thriller. So Jerry threw down was actually 3 action films.
Okay, that figures.
And it was literally a wall of scripts. I walked into this sort of office, and it wasn't even his main office. This was his location office, and a desk the size of an aircraft carrier. And it was absolutely, in those days, the scripts were all on paper.
Yeah.
So they stored them in their offices, and it literally was a wall, and you can read every title written on the outside of the script. And I don't know whether he pulled them scripts out randomly or he had them marked, but I was a bit overawed at the time, so I wasn't concentrating, and he did throw them down. I read 3 Jerry scripts, and I picked Con Air, but I also had to turn down the romantic comedy from the other studio and the spy thriller from the European company. But the thing about Con Air was it was actually very small when I got it. Yeah. It was written as a small character piece. And he said, we need to turn this into a summer movie. So it was actually had almost no action in it. And the plot was very simple and just took place on the airplane as, they didn't even get off the airplane, but it was a very small character piece. So my job was to sort of go through it and actually amp it up and come up with the set pieces and come up with new sequences. And every time a new big film came out in the summer when we were prepping it, Jerry would come in and say, "You got to make the scene bigger. You got to make it bigger. You got to make it." I just kept going and enlarging everything until it was this operatic giant thing. And also, to me, it is very comedic. I mean, it was marketed as the time as a white knuckle ride, but I was actually a very I like comedy a lot, and I watch a lot of comedy, so I couldn't help put a lot of comedy in it because it was such a ridiculous situation that I had to go with the wry humor of it rather than do a straight. I don't think it would be that interesting if it was a straight ahead action film.
It's your barbecue, it tastes good, what can I say?
Exactly.
I mean, in hindsight, also around the time, I remember, I wouldn't ask this at the time, but I think in hindsight, I hopefully it doesn't sound stirry because it's genuinely not, but I just remember some prickly interview answers that people like John Malkovich and John Cusack gave around the time of the film's release. And whilst I'm not asking you to comment on that per se, again, I just want to go back to the fact you're a first-time director in the midst of making this movie, and how you feel about stuff like that when you've got a film coming out. Is that kind of water off a duck's back to you? Are you able to separate yourself a bit from it?
Well, I mean, in hindsight now, it's all fine. It's people like the film and everything. I mean, at the time, it's very hard being a first-time director on a film of that scale, and and quite rightly so. People do. Are very wary because they go, Jerry took a lot of faith in giving me the film and, supporting me. But some would say it was foolhardy and, and it probably was in some ways, but we got away with it. But there was there's a 50-50 chance it could have just imploded. And so there were some people who were very unsupportive when I was making it, behind the camera, as well as in front of it, but not really the actors, but there were people behind it who weren't very supportive, but there were a lot who were really supportive and really helped me and got me through it. But I don't really resent the people that were a bit sniffy because I probably would have been as well, because it was a ridiculous situation to give a first-time director something of this size, and and I got away with it, and it turned out okay, but it could have gone horribly wrong.
I'm not one for sycophancy in interviews as a rule, but let's be clear, it turned out great.
Yeah, I could not judge it for years, and I really didn't know what it. All my films actually, once they're made, I don't really watch them again, because I've watched it 1,000 times in editing, and also I tend to watch when I watch one of my films, I see the bits that didn't go right. Everyone else sees what's on the screen. I go, well, what should have been in that scene or what I was trying to do. And so I kind of see the negative version. So it's not great for me to watch my own films. But it's in time, it's settled down.
That's great. Career-wise, though, one thing I did want to ask you is I wonder if just as transformative for you was the film that you did next. moving on to The General's Daughter, which was not the film that I guess stereotypically we would have expected from someone who'd made their directorial debut with a Bruckheimer production. And I'm not snobbish about that in the slightest, as I think you've probably worked out. But The General's Daughter seemed like quite a left turn at that point. And I'm curious, was that very much a deliberate choice just to go and do something unexpected? And what your recollection of that film was? Because I think it's overlooked just what a hit that was as well.
Yeah, funny enough, General's Daughter actually made more money in the States than Con Air did.
It was about
and it was
million,
sort of,
isn't it? Or something like that. Isn't it?
Yeah, it was slightly, but it was quite a dark drama.
Yeah, cool.
And, it was, it was number one in the summer against James Bond and things like that. So it was a very unusual way it came out. But it's actually my favorite film I made because it's the one that came out the most how I wanted it to. And I think it was definitely a deliberate choice to go for something, but it wasn't intended to shock people or to say I'm doing something different. It was just because I was really interested in the story, the script, and I wanted to do something like that. And it wasn't a deliberate career thing. I mean, I do remember right after Con Air, Jerry came to me with a couple of other things. One was Gone in 60 Seconds. And, it's the same writer, Scott Rosenberg, who I love, Jerry, who I love, Nick Cage was the lead, who I love. Yeah. And then now I would probably go, oh, what fun that would be to go and do it all again with it. But at the time I said, you know what, it's too similar world to Con Air. It's kind of Americana, it's same sense of humor, it's the same actors, everything's the same. And so I deliberately didn't do that. And went for General Store because it was a drama. But funny enough, I did bring Scott Rosenberg in to help me rewrite it. Yeah. So that's where a lot of the humor also came from the book and Scott when we sat down to rewrite it. So it wasn't a total swerve, but it was definitely a world that I'm interested in, those sort of dark, atmospheric dramas. It's the sort of film I watch. Yeah. I actually don't really watch a lot of action films because it's sort of a busman's holiday, and when you spend 18 months making one, I don't then go home and sit down and watch a lot of others because it's not really a break.
But my time's nearly up, but I just want to ask you as well that I read the biography of Sherry Lansing that came out a year or two ago that I know you were interviewed for. And I didn't get quite just how fraught the rights issue was on the Tomb Raider film that you did, about how there was such a small window on that movie to get it moving, else Paramount would have lost the rights to the film and it would all had to go to square one. And I mean, in Lansing's biography, it comes across like you were the person who came in and saved that film. But I'm curious just if you've experienced anything quite like that before, and just what position you found yourself in, being dropped into the middle of a film with a very heavily ticking clock and umpteen drafts that hadn't quite cracked it.
Yeah, that is a very difficult situation, and in retrospect, that pressure was not good for the outcome of a film. Sometimes deadlines are really good, and it's deadlines. Usually they're really good because otherwise people will faff around endlessly, guide us. So it was a pressure to get it done in time, and I don't know whether it really affected it, but you have to be experienced in making those kind of films as a studio. And I did The General's Daughter with Paramount, which was a drama, and they were really good at dramas, and they knew how to support them and how to promote them and market them, and they understood them and sort of let me alone to do what I liked on The General's Daughter. I think that one of the problems is that Paramount at that time was trying to enter the sort of summer blockbuster world, and Tomb Raider was a new type of film for them. And if it had been done, if Jerry was doing it at Disney or Warner Brothers or something, who are old hands at those summer blockbusters, they would have easily known how to sort of crack every nut. But I think I did feel like the whole thing was on my shoulders because I was the only one that made a summer blockbuster, and it's very hard to make a film of that size on your own with a tiny window, as you say, of like, if you don't get everything done in the next few weeks, everyone's going to lose the rights and it's going to crash and burn. I mean, but afterwards, I mean, Sherry was very complimentary and said, it's one of our most profitable films, and which is obviously important to the studio. But I feel like if it had more time and I could have had more space to do what I do, it could have turned out better. But it's still an unusual film, and I still think Angelina was a huge bonus and a find for it, because and I had to really fight for her to be in the film, because it was. So that was one of my main victories, I thought, is getting her in the film, because it was, nobody wanted it, the studio, the producers, and I had to fight so hard, and got her in the end. And so I think if anything came of it was good, was that Angelina sort of got on the sort of A-list roller coaster after that.
And just to wrap up then, I mean, we've established you're doing a Con Air sci-fi sequel musical in space, so that's good news. I know Obviously. You've already shot The Legend Hunters as well, even as we sit here talking now. If I can just ask about one other project that always bubbled around with you, because you were going to do Thunder Run at one point, and you always sounded hugely passionate about that particular film, and this would involve Gerard Butler and tanks and the war, and I'm curious if that's got any chance of coming back to life.
Well, it never really went away. It's one of those scripts that every actor I've ever shown it to has absolutely loved it and wanted to sign on, and that's not often happens. Sometimes you have to persuade people to get it, and so it's never dead. And even as we speak, it's one of those things that I continually push on, and it could very well be made. The world has changed in the sort of 10 years I've been developing it, and budgets have shrunk, and so I've had to sort of reimagine how to do it in many ways. But it's still an incredible story, and I wouldn't be surprised if it gets made, fairly soon.
Well, I look forward to seeing it if it happens, and I wish you all the best with The Legend Hunters and with Skyfire as well. Simon West, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
And that then was my conversation with Simon West. Skyfire, if you want to check it out, is on DVD and Blu-ray in the UK now. I do think it's a lot of fun. I do think it's worth having a look at. And that brings to the end this particular episode. You can find more of my waffling at Simon Brew. You can find lots of older Film Stories episodes that have dropped off the iTunes page, actually. If you go to filmstories.co.uk/podcast, the Film Stories website that I've just given you the address to as well is where I put up every weekday loads of movie news, features as well. That's been growing nicely, and I hugely appreciate the support there. Likewise, if you do like this podcast, please do subscribe at your podcast home of choice. Ideally, leave me a hugely glowing review. It's small things like that help independent podcast publishers like myself as well. I'm going to leave you in peace and go and work on the next issue of Film Stories magazine now, which you can read about also on the aforementioned website, and I'll be back with your regular weekly episode of the Film Stories podcast shortly. Most important thing, as always, is you all take care and look after yourselves. Thank you so much for listening, and bye-bye. Bye.